It wasn't a contested zone, not officially. The mission brief had labeled it low risk, light enemy presence, minimal anti-air threat, short-range recon with an immediate extract window, the kind of deployment that didn't raise concern, didn't invite contingency planning beyond the basics. A routine infill via Black Hawk, one SEAL team on board, tasked with confirming the status of a suspected weapons cache nestled in a ravine west of the border. In and out, 3 hours on the ground, standard. But war doesn't care about classifications, and maps don't bleed until someone adds the red. The first sign of something wrong wasn't the smoke. It was the silence. The moment the wheels kissed the dirt and the rotor blades began to slow, something felt off. The birds overhead stopped chirping. The wind stilled. And then, like a snap from a forgotten snare, a white-hot trail screamed from the tree line. An RPG fired with perfect timing, striking the rear of the Black Hawk in a bloom of fire and metal. The blast shredded the tail rotor, forcing the bird into a violent spin before it collapsed sideways onto the valley floor. In that instant, every protocol shattered. Fire engulfed the rear cabin, choking it with black smoke and molten debris. The team poured out into chaos, responding through reflex, not instruction, securing the perimeter, returning fire, extracting wounded. The air filled with dirt, shrapnel, and the sound of survival. One of them never made it to the perimeter. He wasn't seen falling. No one saw him go down. He didn't call out, didn't signal. He was just gone. Amid the smoke, the splintered metal, the screams and confusion, his absence became invisible. And when the quick extract was called and the survivors lifted off under suppressive fire, they didn't realize what had happened. Not until the mission clock reset, and one name didn't check in. He hadn't died in the crash. He wasn't captured. He wasn't even wounded, at least not at first. He was alone, 30 kilometers behind hostile lines, with no radio, no backup, and no orders. And instead of hiding, he got up. He moved. And what he did next wouldn't just rewrite the mission. It would make his name echo through the corridors of every Special Operations Command Center for years to come. The first 8 minutes of flight were textbook. The Black Hawk cut low across the valley floor, rotors thumping steadily beneath the overcast night, masking its presence against the ambient noise of the terrain. The operators inside were calm, silent, checking gear for the final time. Each man knew his role. The terrain below was familiar, barren scrubland broken by patches of forest and ridges carved by ancient runoff. No lights on the ground, no comms interference, clean, controlled, an easy insert. They touched down in a dry riverbed flanked by 2 narrow rock formations, ideal natural cover. One by one the SEALs moved out in coordinated pairs, boots striking stone with practiced precision. The team's point man secured the northern approach while 2 others took a southern perimeter. Their comms tech called in a status ping. No anomalies, all clear. Then came the sound no one wanted to hear. A single metallic thud, unmistakably foreign. It was too fast for anyone to react. An RPG screamed in from the ridgeline and struck the rear fuselage of the Black Hawk. The explosion was deafening. Fire engulfed the rotor in less than 2 seconds. The impact lifted the entire tail off the ground, shoving the aircraft forward into a jagged spin. The nose plowed into rock and dirt, the entire bird listing sideways before collapsing in a heap of metal and fire. The inside of the bird went black, then orange, then nothing but chaos. A wall of smoke filled the cabin, and the entire rear compartment buckled inward from the blast. Fuel leaked and ignited. Plastic melted into armor. The air burned. Screams mixed with warning alarms and static. One SEAL, thrown hard against the bulkhead during the impact, woke up seconds later with a sharp jolt to his spine and no sensation in his left foot. He coughed through a lungful of soot and tried to crawl forward, but a piece of sheared paneling had pinned his leg. Through half-blind vision and instinct, he kicked his way free, dragging himself toward the light bleeding in through a hole in the hull. Outside, the rest of the team had already engaged. Gunfire erupted from the trees along the eastern ridge, short bursts from AK-pattern rifles flashing in the dark. The SEALs returned fire immediately, fanning out, using the terrain for cover. A call for emergency extraction went up the chain, but the window for safe recovery was rapidly closing. A second RPG struck near the nose of the wreckage but failed to detonate. The team assumed everyone who was mobile had cleared the crash. No one noticed the missing man. He had crawled 50 feet away from the wreckage by the time the firefight peaked. His head was spinning. Blood trickled from his temple. His ankle, twisted at a sharp, wrong angle, throbbed in pulses that blurred his vision. Still, he kept moving. He made it to a shallow ditch where runoff had carved a depression between the rock outcrops. There, half buried in dust and pain, he waited, listening to the firefight unravel above him. From his position, he couldn't see the team, couldn't see the enemy, but he heard everything. The sharp cracks of suppressed rifles, the distinct rhythm of fire teams bounding, the bark of commands through gritted teeth. Then came the roar of rotors. The QRF had arrived. It swept low, pouring down suppressive fire. Shouts echoed. Bodies moved. The bird screamed overhead and the rest of the team lifted out, disappearing into the smoke and blackness. Then silence. No one came back. He was left in the ditch with one working rifle, a crushed radio, and a pain in his leg that bordered on blinding. Above him, the remains of the Black Hawk still smoldered, its frame curled like an animal in death. Flames flickered in the fuel-stained dirt. He could hear footsteps, distant, careful. Not American boots. He knew the difference. He dragged himself deeper into the culvert and lay flat. A flashlight beam swept overhead but didn't penetrate the depth of his hiding place. He held his breath. 10 seconds, then 30, a minute. The footsteps moved on. He was alone. In that moment, the world shrank to a few square feet of dust and darkness. He reached down, pressed 2 fingers into the edge of his boot, and bit back a scream as he tried to flex the ankle. It didn't flex. Swollen, possibly fractured. Still usable, barely. He pulled his canteen, drank 1 mouthful, and took stock. His M4 had sustained damage. Cracked receiver, jammed selector. Useless. He rolled it away. His sidearm was intact. 2 spare mags, 1 combat knife, 1 compression bandage, a field tourniquet. No working comms, no drone link, no air cover. He wrapped his ankle tight, cinched it with a tie from his harness, and crawled back to the lip of the ditch just enough to scan the slope with his scope. 2 enemy fighters walked past, rifles slung, inspecting the wreckage. He held his breath and sank back. He wasn't in a position to fight. Not yet. The adrenaline had faded now, and the cold crept in. The valley air turned sharp after sundown. He shivered uncontrollably for 10 minutes, teeth rattling like loose metal in his jaw. But he didn't sleep. Couldn't. Every sound kept him wired. Every flicker of movement on the periphery set his hand twitching toward his sidearm. By 0300, he had made a choice. Waiting was death. He didn't know if anyone would come. He didn't know if they even knew he was alive. The crash zone had been cleared, and without comms, he was just a footprint in a footprintless valley. But he wasn't dead. Not yet. And he wouldn't die here, not without a fight. When the sky began to lighten just slightly along the ridgeline, he pulled the knife from its sheath, checked his pistol's chamber, and began to crawl west, into the unknown. Under the slow creep of pre-dawn haze, he dragged himself from the ditch and up the back slope of a crumbled gully, every movement dictated by the rhythm of pain and necessity. The valley stretched out before him like a puzzle, filled with shadow and danger and pathways that only led deeper into enemy-controlled terrain. There was no route home, no beacon guiding him to safety. He had no map, no working comms, no knowledge of where the rest of his team had gone. But he had terrain. He had memory, and he had instinct. He knew how to move unseen, how to disappear. He began by crawling, pulling his body inch by inch through shallow, dry earth. The ankle refused to hold weight, throbbing with every jolt, every scrape of gear against rock. He adjusted by binding it tighter with a torn compression strap, wrapping it until the circulation slowed and the pain turned to something distant. Then he focused on breathing. Shallow. Controlled. He drank only a mouthful of water, enough to wet his mouth, then capped the canteen. He didn't know how long it had to last, but he assumed the worst. Days. Maybe more. The first few hundred meters were the hardest. Every ridgeline felt exposed, every loose rock a potential alarm. He moved with the deliberate flow of muscle memory, stopping at intervals to scan with his scope, studying the terrain not as a survivor, but as a hunter who had reversed roles. His job now was not to find. It was to avoid being found. Just before dawn, he discovered a natural overhang, an erosion-cut ledge halfway up a hillside. It offered concealment, shadow, and a natural field of view back toward the crash site. He crawled inside, pulled dirt and stone over the entrance, and waited. As light filled the valley, he watched as 4 enemy fighters moved around the wreckage, inspecting debris, pulling what gear they could from the smoldering carcass of the bird. They weren't in a hurry. They didn't fear retribution. There was no air cover, no second team arriving. Whatever he'd hoped would come wasn't coming. He counted the men, watched their patterns, noted weapons, mostly AK variants, 2 with radios, 1 with binoculars. Local militia, probably trained by foreign volunteers. He tracked their movement across the site, but didn't engage. Shooting now would be suicide. He had to conserve ammo, choose everything deliberately. By late morning, they cleared out. 1 vehicle arrived, collected gear and bodies, and left in a slow trail of dust. The smoke from the wreckage had thinned but still hung low, a signal to everyone for miles that something had happened here. He knew others would come soon, more organized, better equipped, maybe even an investigative team looking for survivors or remains. He couldn't be here when that happened. He opened his small survival kit. Inside, he found what he expected. 1 sterile dressing, 3 iodine tablets, a flint striker, and a single folded map with no GPS overlay. It was the kind of map you carried as backup, useless for navigation, but enough to orient to landmarks. He studied it, traced ridgelines with his finger, and triangulated his location using what he remembered from the flight path and visual landmarks. He found a river, a road, a possible village, then a ridgeline that led west, deeper but more remote, a way out, or at least a way away. He ate a few bites from a crushed protein bar, replaced the ankle wrap, and began moving again, using the terrain to his advantage. Low scrub, broken rock, goat trails used by local herders. He moved slow but smart, zigzagging his path, never cresting hills, always crossing below the skyline. When he rested, he did so flat, covering himself with dust and loose stone, blending into the terrain. By afternoon, the heat arrived, not searing, but dry and draining. Sweat carved lines down his face, caught in the grit layered over his skin. He kept moving, rested when the pain in his leg became unbearable, then pushed again. He found a small runoff pool beneath a shaded cliff, muddy but drinkable. He strained the water through his shirt into his canteen, dropped 1 iodine tablet, and drank carefully, 1 sip at a time, just enough to survive. He reached the crest of a long ridgeline by evening and spotted movement below. A 2-man patrol, rifles slung, walking casually across a footpath that curved along the base of a hill. Locals, maybe. Maybe not. He watched them pass, committed the path to memory, and moved the opposite direction. He couldn't afford a single wrong engagement. Every bullet had to matter. That night, he found shelter in a crevice between 2 limestone boulders. He couldn't light a fire, couldn't risk smoke or scent. He pressed his back against the stone, knees tucked to his chest, wrapped in the torn remains of his pack cover. He shivered as the temperature dropped, his fingers cramped from dehydration and strain. Sleep came in fragments, seconds at a time. When he dreamed of the explosion, the weight of the rotor, the stillness of the valley after the team had lifted off without him. At dawn, he moved again, limping now, using a scavenged tree branch as a crutch. He spotted a trail of boot prints not his own, deep, sharp, recent. At least 4 men, traveling light. He followed at a distance, staying upslope, tracking them to a small outpost on the edge of a wooded stretch. He watched for hours, counting shifts, memorizing positions. He didn't have the weapons to engage, but he wasn't interested in fighting. He was interested in gear, water, ammunition, information. When night fell again, he made his move. He circled behind the outpost, cutting through a dry gully, moving silently, slowly, never allowing his boots to touch rock. He found a storage shed, unlocked. Inside, rations, bottled water, batteries. He took only what he needed, left no trace. When a sentry passed nearby, he froze in place for 17 minutes, barely breathing, heart hammering in his ears. The man never saw him. He retreated before dawn, climbed higher into the hills, and built a hide beneath a collapsed tree. There he checked his ankle. It had ballooned, purple and yellow, but still mobile. He flexed it, winced, and repacked it with cloth. He ate slowly, drank more water, and waited for sunlight to return. He was still alone, still lost, still behind enemy lines. But he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was adapting, rebuilding. Piece by piece, the seal they thought they'd left behind was beginning to hunt again. Under the weight of exhaustion and the pulse of a swollen ankle, the shift from hunted to hunter wasn't marked by a sudden act of aggression. It began slowly, instinctually, in the quiet spaces between movement and observation. He had no plan to fight. Not at first. He was still underarmed, injured, deep in hostile territory. But as the hours passed and the terrain revealed more than it concealed, patterns began to emerge. Enemy routines, patrol gaps, supply drops, rhythms of a war effort that believed itself uncontested in this valley. These weren't random movements. These were clockwork behaviors, predictable, exploitable, and that realization was the spark. He wouldn't run. He'd bleed them slowly, quietly, purposefully. The first opportunity came on the third night. He had tracked a two-man scout team from the outpost, one of several rotating night patrols responsible for checking key ridgelines. They moved with confidence, chatting softly in a dialect he couldn't fully place, rifles slung across shoulders, barely scanning their flanks. Complacency had taken root. He shadowed them from above, crawling over shale and sand with the precision of a predator. The SEAL's injured legs screamed with every lurch forward, but pain had long since become background noise. They paused at a crest to smoke, their backs to the slope. That was the moment. He didn't hesitate. One rock, fist-sized, heavy, ancient, cracked the skull of the rearmost man before he could speak. The other spun, eyes wide, reaching for his weapon too slowly. The SEAL took him down with a low, explosive lunge, driving him into the dirt and crushing the wind from his lungs. It was messy, brutal, but it was done. He didn't waste time with cleanup. He dragged the bodies into a narrow depression behind the rocks, took their radios, their water, and a pair of grenades wired together with twine and tension pins. That night, he climbed another ridge and used one of the stolen radios to monitor enemy chatter. Most of it was routine, supply requests, position reports. But there was unease in the voices. Someone knew patrols were missing. The term for him had shifted, no longer survivor, now it was the shadow. In the days that followed, he moved like one. He stole without being seen. A weatherproof tarp from a shepherd's hut. A battered pair of binoculars left behind on a checkpoint ledge. Ammunition stripped from unattended caches, careful not to take too much from any one place. His pace never changed. His exposure remained minimal. He was methodical, surgical, unseen, a ghost stitched into the folds of the valley. On the sixth day, he hit a supply team. 3 men unloading crates at a forward drop point, no guards posted. He waited until nightfall, cut a sliver of wire from a nearby comms tower, and rigged a crude snare to trigger one of that grenades. When the team returned the next morning, the blast echoed up the valley. He watched from 400 meters away through the cracked lens of his salvaged scope. 1 man killed, 2 injured. The resupply route abandoned by afternoon. From then on, they moved in pairs, then trios, then groups of 5. More vehicles, more noise. Their posture changed. Radios barked constantly now. Orders were shouted instead of whispered. Fear had entered the equation. They were reacting, not controlling. They didn't know who or what they were chasing. He kept moving, higher into the hills. Each night he built a new hide. Never in the same place twice. Each day he studied their movement, looking for openings. He mapped their network in his head. Where they stored fuel. Where they staged weapons. Who they trusted with command. With the scavenged binoculars, he tracked faces, patterns, leadership. He watched 1 man direct 3 convoys from the same checkpoint 3 days in a row. On the 4th, the SEAL left a parting gift. 2 wires, 1 grenade, and a 10-second fuse. When the officer stepped onto the ledge to give orders, the blast took his legs. Panic spread like oil fire. By the end of the first week, they had doubled security across the valley. Drone passes became more frequent, their altitude lower, sweeps wider. Foot patrols became convoys, but they never saw him. Not once. He moved below their range, traveled at night, rested in the heat of the day. He left no trail, no prints, no blood, only fear. His ankle, while not healed, had stiffened into something usable. He bound it with reinforced tape, braced with scavenged steel from a drone's damaged casing. It gave him range, not speed, but enough to reposition when needed. With his field knife, he carved markers into rock at high points, leaving himself a map only he could read. He was building a perimeter, a hunting ground. When he finally took a weapon from a fallen enemy, it was deliberate. Not for firepower, for efficiency. A clean, low-profile carbine, worn, but functional. Enough to lay suppression or secure an escape route if he had to. He cleaned it in a stream, checked the firing pin, zeroed it manually with a single test shot on a stone. Then he wrapped it in burlap and re-hit it. It wasn't time yet. He saved the last of his pistol rounds, keeping them dry in a plastic pouch inside his boot. Not for desperation, for certainty. When the time came, he didn't dream anymore. Sleep was shallow. Eyes open before threats arrived. He'd learned to wake to soundless shifts in wind, to the distant change of tires on gravel. He timed his movements to cloud cover. Knew when goats moved. Knew when locals carried water. He'd become the thing they whispered about on night watch. They believed he was a team, a unit, a special group deployed for vengeance. They never imagined it was one man. Just one. And he wasn't finished. By the 8th day, he had learned everything he needed to know about the fuel depot. It was primitive but operational, carved into a shallow basin at the junction of two low mountain roads. 4 steel drums served as the primary storage units, each weathered and blackened from repeated use, surrounded by stacked crates of supplies and a makeshift tarp canopy for shade. It was manned lightly. 3 men on rotation. No formal security, no towers, no dogs. The enemy believed its remoteness was protection enough. They were wrong. That kind of arrogance was his invitation. He spent 3 nights observing the depot from different elevations. He watched the shift changes, the delivery routes, and the exact timing of when each sentry took a break to smoke or eat. He noted the position of every lamp, the path of every vehicle, the brief power outages when the generator sputtered and died. On the 3rd night, he found a route in, a narrow erosion trench that ran parallel to the perimeter, concealed by thorn bushes and discarded scrap. From the trench, he could reach the northern corner of the compound undetected. The closest drum was less than 30 feet from that point. That would be enough. He didn't need an explosion to kill. He needed one to send a message. The materials were already in his possession. A magnesium strip scavenged from a broken flashlight, dry grass, a metal shaving tin for a controlled burn, and 2 thin wires from the interior of the stolen enemy radio. He tested the components twice, silently, under moonlight, with only the glow of embers to verify ignition. The key was delay. He had to be out before the fire drew attention. He moved on the 4th night, just past 0300, beneath a thin veil of fog drifting low across the basin. His ankle was wrapped in cloth soaked in creek water, both to numb it and mask scent. His carbine was disassembled and stowed in a sling. He carried only his sidearm, the ignition kit, and a blade. He approached from the west, descending the trench slowly, belly to stone, each inch gained through patient pulls of his elbows. A jackal barked in the distance. 3 sharp notes. He froze, listened, then kept moving. A low breeze shifted the tarps of the depot, causing them to flap once, then fall still again. 2 guards were awake. One sat with his back to the fire pit, smoking. The other walked a lazy perimeter, pausing often to spit or adjust his belt. They were bored, undisciplined, unaware. He reached the drum, pressed his body against it, listened to the slow creak of metal warming in the night air. The fuel sloshed softly inside. He peeled back the flap of the tin and laid the magnesium strip gently against the edge of the drum's base. The wire, pre-twisted into a tension loop, was affixed to a folded piece of cloth soaked in oil. He packed the dry grass under the lip of the drum, set the timer, a simple twist of pressure that would catch flame after the tension released, and backed away. No rush, no panic, just retreating steps, each placed in the hollow of the last, reversing his crawl out the way he came. At 200 meters, he stopped to observe. The ignition took after 3 minutes. A flicker, then a bright silver flash, magnesium lighting up with searing intensity, feeding the dry grass and drawing a narrow line of fire upward. Then the heat caught the drum. The explosion didn't roar. It cracked, like a bone under pressure, then bloomed into an orange fireball that reached 10 meters into the sky. The second drum ignited instantly. The third moments later. The blast wave didn't reach him, but the heat did. He turned away as the air shimmered and the depot vanished into flame. Shouts followed, radio squawks, then gunfire, pointless, wild, fired into the smoke and darkness. Vehicles arrived within minutes. Searchlights swung over the hillsides, but he was already gone, buried in the rocks, watching from above. The response was chaotic. They hadn't trained for this. They hadn't expected someone to hit them from the inside. The next morning, he watched through his scope as the commanders argued, pointing at burned debris, shouting orders into radios. He noted their faces, marked their cadence, memorized who deferred to whom. Their power structure was visible now. Their confusion was audible. He had not only wounded their infrastructure, he had cracked their confidence. That day the drones returned. Low passes, wider sweeps, erratic flight paths betraying desperation. They were searching for a team, a task force, something logical. They never once considered it could be one man. One injured American, alone in the hills, with no command, no support, and no mercy left. He didn't rest that day. He relocated, climbed higher, buried himself in a natural trench on the windward side of a slope. From there, he slept in 5-minute shifts, one eye open. He ate the last of his rations, hard crackers and dried fruit, and drank meltwater pooled under the edge of a boulder. He rewrapped his ankle, checked his sidearm, and cleaned his blade with spit and cloth. Then he listened. The radio spoke in fragments now. Panic. Commanders blaming subordinates. Scouting teams ordered to comb areas already cleared. No one trusted the reports anymore. They didn't know if they were being hunted or if the hunter was already inside. That night, he watched an enemy patrol walk in circles for 40 minutes before abandoning their post entirely. The chain was fraying, and he was pulling at one thread at a time. But he wasn't done. Not yet. The depot was only the first. There were more places to burn, more messages to deliver, and he would write them in fire. On the 10th morning, as the valley breathed its first heat under a pale orange sky, the SEAL lay prone in the shadow of a broken ridgeline, his face caked in dust, eyes narrowed behind a cracked lens he'd been using as an improvised monocular. He was skeletal now, his body stripped of excess, dried by sun, tightened by tension and starvation. His ankle was held together with cloth, twine, and stubbornness. The infection hadn't set in, not fully, but the swelling had reached his calf. Every step was fire, but he still moved, still climbed, still fought. By now, the name the locals whispered wasn't a myth. It was a warning. The ghost, the fire starter, the American who wouldn't die. The fuel depot was gone, reduced to ash and twisted metal. Since then, he'd made no more attacks. He wasn't hiding. He was waiting, listening, moving only when the clouds covered the moon. The radio he'd taken still worked, but he hadn't used it. Not until now. Not until he was sure. Not until there was something worth saying. From the ridge, he could see the northern shelf where the drone corridor cut across the valley floor. They had returned. High altitude, fast orbits, likely outfitted with infrared and SIGINT. But they hadn't found him. Every time one passed overhead, he buried himself in earth, covered in a salvaged thermal blanket and crushed grass. From above, he was terrain. Now, with the sun low and the wind mild, he reached into the pocket of his field shirt and pulled out the piece he'd been saving. A piece of mirror, square, no larger than his palm, smoothed along one side and marked with grease pencil. He crawled to a clearing and planted a rock with a crude V carved into it, angled north. Then he waited for the glint, the shimmer of the drone's sensor arc, and signaled. Short flashes, deliberate. He didn't write a sentence, just 3 characters repeated, SOS in light. He didn't know if they'd see it, but he knew they were watching. He repeated the signal every 4 minutes, changing his position each time. After 17 minutes, the drone path changed. Slower pass, lower. Then it vanished. He waited. Hours passed. By dusk, he had crawled to a new position. Higher, closer to a known LZ once used by coalition forces 6 months prior. It was abandoned now, overgrown and cracked, but still clear enough for a fast touch and go. He chose it not for comfort, but because of its history. He knew command would have the grid on record. If someone was coming, they'd come here. At 1837, his radio crackled. Just once. Static, then silence. He adjusted the dial, cleared dust from the internal contacts, tapped it against his chest, and listened again. This time it spoke. A call sign. His. Followed by 2 words. Confirm location. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved 20 meters downslope, aligned his mirror again, and flashed a longer signal, location beacon pattern, the kind used in emergency doctrine when radios are compromised. Then the static returned. Then silence. He waited, watching the sky, breathing in dirt. It came fast. At 1913, he heard it. Rotors, distant at first, then swelling into the unmistakable thunder of a black hawk flying nap of the earth, blades chopping air like a drumbeat of salvation. Dust lifted in a widening cone as the bird crested the ridge and banked hard, dropping low into the LZ with a steep nose. The side doors were already open. Gunners posted, medics ready. The bird hovered as the ground team scanned with thermal and optics. He stepped into view without drama, walking slowly, rifle slung, pistol low, one hand raised at his side. He limped through the dust, boots dragging, every ounce of him coated in grime, skin drawn tight against bone. When the crew reached him, they didn't shout, didn't ask. They just reached out, steadied him, pulled him into the cabin. He collapsed against the floor, back flat, chest rising in shallow bursts. A medic began triage immediately, checking the ankle, testing for breaks, pressing gauze into cuts that had long since scabbed over. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. When they offered water, he drank it slow, one sip at a time like a man tasting it for the first time. As the Black Hawk lifted off, the valley rolled beneath them, silent and scorched, the wreckage of the depot still visible in the distance, a long black scar on the edge of the forest. The pilot banked hard, turned east, and disappeared into altitude. He didn't look back. The medics wrapped him in thermal, ran vitals, administered fluids. One asked his name. He didn't answer. Not because he couldn't, but because it didn't matter. Not yet. They brought him to Fob Hadar under cover of night. No welcome party. No cameras. Just a stretch of lightless tarmac and a medical bay waiting with open hands. The doctors scanned, sutured, hydrated. His ankle would require surgery. His lungs were full of dust. His shoulder had cracked on impact during the crash. But he was stable, alive, and more importantly, intact. Command debriefed him 72 hours later. He spoke only once during the initial interview. They asked what he'd done. He answered with a list: movements, coordinates, targets sabotaged, radios intercepted, number of days alone. When they asked how he survived, he said nothing. Just looked out the window watching sand lift off the edge of the runway. Afterward, his file was classified. The details buried. The team reinserted into standard rotation. No ceremony, no medals, no citations. But the story passed through whispers, through units, through fire bases and forward posts. They called him the one who stayed, the one who came back with no team, no comms, no support, and turned a valley inside out. He hadn't waited to be rescued. He had built his own path out. One step, one breath, one fire at a time. Under fluorescent lights that hummed low and constant, he sat in a debriefing room that had no windows and smelled faintly of antiseptic and sweat. His uniform was clean but oversized, borrowed from the base quartermaster. His face, though washed, still carried the subtle gray undertone of someone not fully returned from where they'd been. The medic's tape on his ankle peeked out from under the pant leg. His left eye was bloodshot from sand exposure. He looked more like a ghost of a man than an operator, but inside, behind the posture and stillness, something in him was sharper than before, more exact. The room was small, a table, a chair, a recorder placed precisely in the center. 2 officers entered, one from Intel, one from Command. They didn't offer him coffee, they didn't smile. They sat and clicked the recorder on. They told him to begin at the crash. He did. His voice was even, mechanical, devoid of flourish. No dramatization, just facts. He outlined the angle of impact, the tail rotor damage, the layout of the terrain, the direction of enemy fire. He recounted the location of every piece of wreckage, the way the smoke drifted downwind, the first patrol that passed by him in the ditch, the exact time he realized he'd been left. He described the ankle injury, how he wrapped it using a modified harness strap, how he rationed his water by counting drops. He listed the items he salvaged, the position of the sun during his crawl to the ridge, the first enemy patrol, the shape of the boot treads they left behind. They didn't interrupt him. He went on. He gave them kill counts, not estimated, confirmed. He listed the 2 scouts he tracked, how he took their gear, where he hid the bodies. He explained the wire trap at the drop site, the magnesium-based ignition method, the way he timed the approach by tracking sentry rotations. He recalled the echo of the fuel tank explosion, the direction of the fire spread, The length of time it took for a response team to arrive. He remembered it all, not in blur, not in fragments, but in order. Sequential, clean. At one point, the intel officer asked how many rounds he'd fired in total. He answered immediately. 12. 4 with the pistol. 8 with scavenged rifles. He then listed each shot, the target, the distance, and the result. No misses. They asked if he had considered surrender. He didn't answer. They didn't ask again. The report was typed up over the next 2 days. 87 pages. Most of it flagged for classification. The official summary called it a survival incident. One operator isolated in an unplanned engagement zone, demonstrating high-level adaptability and individual mission initiative. The language was bureaucratic. The words careful. The deeper version, the one shared behind closed doors, was different. It called him an asset, an outlier, a singular case study in mental and physical endurance under asymmetric conditions. The phrase multi-theater replication potential was mentioned in internal memos. They started asking questions about his training pipeline, who had mentored him, what assessments he had passed, where he had ranked. He was told he'd be removed from rotation pending recovery. His gear was recovered and logged. His damaged rifle, bent scope, blood-streaked boots, the mirror used to signal the drone, all sealed in a black case and transported to a storage unit labeled, "Retained for documentation." None of it would be displayed. None of it needed to be. In the days that followed, operators from other units began asking questions. Quietly. Not in briefings, but at chow, in the gym, between flights. They wanted to know if it was real, if he had really made it out without a squad, if the depot fire was his, if the patrol routes had shifted because of what he did. No one answered, but they all knew. On the 4th day, the commandant of the base found him alone on the range, walking without crutches, dragging his bad foot behind him, empty mag in his hand. He was firing with his offhand, training, still silent, still present, still not asking for anything. The commandant didn't interrupt. They let him go home 2 weeks later. No send-off, no commendation ceremony. He disappeared from the roster, reassigned under a different classification, his name buried under 6 layers of clearance. Just another page in the system. Another asset reshuffled into the silence of Black Ops. But his legend didn't go with him. It stayed behind in the hills, in the wreckage. In the stories whispered over campfires on forward bases when the nights stretched long and missions pressed close. They spoke of the one who was left, the one who turned a valley upside down, who didn't call for help, didn't wait to be found, didn't die in the dark. They told it like folklore, like myth, but always with a quiet edge of truth that made it different from fiction. Because he had returned, and because what he did wasn't an act of heroism. It was a decision, a line drawn in the dirt between being abandoned and choosing not to be lost.